Okay. Time to finish chapter. Holy crap. How long is chapter? Where's the end? I didn't check. Ooh. Okay. It's on page 449? Yes, page 449. Let me ice my mouth. Okay. This blanket is hot. Okay. The war in the West. Events in the Western theater of the war at last provided Lincoln with an able general who did not have to be shelved after every reverse. Ulysses S. Grant had been a mediocre student at West Point, distinguishing himself only in horsemanship, although he did fairly well in mathematics. After fighting creditably in the Mexican War, he was stationed and isolated from frontier posts, where boredom and loneliness drove him to drink. Resigning from the army to avoid a court martial for drunkenness, he failed at various business ventures, and when war came, he was working in his father's leather store in Illinois for $50 a month. Grant did not cut much of a figure. The shy and silent shopkeeper was short-stooped, awkward, and stubble-bearded, and sloppy in dress. He managed with some difficulty to secure a colonelcy in the volunteers. From then on, his military experience, combined with his boldness, resourcefulness, and tenacity, catapulted him on a meteoric rise. Grant's first signal success came in the Northern Tennessee Theater. After having fighting, he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland Rivers in February 1862. When the Confederate commander at Fort Donelson asked for terms, Grant bluntly demanded an unconditional and immediate surrender. Grant's triumph in Tennessee was crucial. It not only riveted Kentucky more securely to the Union, but it also opened the gateway to the strategically important region of Tennessee, as well as to Georgia in the heart of Dixie. Grant next attempted to exploit his victory by capturing the junction of the main Confederate north-south and east-west railroads in the Mississippi Valley at Corinth, Mississippi, but a Confederate force foiled his plans in a gory battle at Shiloh, just over the Tennessee border from Corinth, on April 6 to 7, 1862. Although Grant successfully counterattacked, the impressive Confederate showing at Shiloh confirmed that there would be no quick end to the war in the West. Lincoln resisted all demands for the removal of unconditional surrender, Grant insisting, "I can't spare this man, he fights." When the talebearer later told Lincoln that Grant drank too much, the president allegedly replied, "Find me the brand, and I'll send a barrel to each of my other generals." There's no evidence that Grant's drinking habits seriously impaired his military performance. Other Union thrusts in the West were in the making. In the spring of 1862, a flotilla commanded by David G. Farragut joined in the Northern Army to strike the South a blow by seizing New Orleans. Ow! I inhaled my spit. Oh, that was awful. A flotilla commanded by David G. Farragut joined with the Northern Army to strike the South a blow by seizing New Orleans. With Union gunboats both ascending and descending the Mississippi, the eastern part of the Confederacy was left with a jeopardized back door. Through this narrowing entrance between Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Port Hudson, Louisiana, flowed herds of vitally needed cattle and other provisions from Louisiana and Texas. The fortress of Vicksburg, located on a hairpin turn of the Mississippi, was the South Sentinel protecting the lifeline to the western sources of supply. General Grant was now given command of the Union forces attacking Vicksburg, and in the teeth of grave difficulties displayed rare skill and daring. The siege of Vicksburg was his best-fought campaign of the war. The beleaguered city at length surrendered on July 4, 1863, with the garrison reduced to eating mules and rats. 5 days later came the fall of Fort Hudson, the last southern bastion on the Mississippi. The spinal cord of the Confederacy was now severed, and in Lincoln's quaint phrase, "The Father of Waters at last flowed unvexed to the sea." The Union victory at Vicksburg came the day after the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. The political significance of these back-to-back military successes was monumental. Reopening the Mississippi helped to quell the Northern peace agitation in the butternut area of the Ohio River Valley. Confederate control of the Mississippi had cut off the region's usual trade routes down the Ohio-Mississippi River system to New Orleans, thus adding economic pain to that border section's already shaky support for the Abolition War. The twin victories also conclusively tipped the diplomatic scales in favor of the North, as Britain stopped delivery of the Laird rams to Confederates, and as France killed a deal for the sale of 6 naval vessels to the Richmond government. By the end of 1863, all Confederate hopes for foreign help were irretrievably lost. Sherman scorches Georgia. General Grant, the victor of Vicksburg, was now transferred to the East Tennessee Theater, where Confederates had driven Union forces from the battlefield at Chickamauga into the city of Chattanooga, to which they then laid siege. Grant won a series of desperate engagements in November 1863 to the vicinity of besieged Chattanooga, including Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, the battle above the clouds. Chattanooga was liberated, the state was cleared of Confederates, and the key was thus opened for an invasion of Georgia. Grant was rewarded by being made general-in-chief. Georgia's conquest was entrusted to General William Tecumseh Sherman. Red-haired and red-bearded, grim-faced and ruthless, he captured Atlanta on September 1864 and burned the city in November of that year. He then daringly left his supply base, lived off the country for some 250 miles, and weeks later emerged at Savannah on the sea. A rousing northern song, marching through Georgia, said, "Sherman's dashing Yankee boys will never reach the coast." So the saucy rebels said, and 'twas a handsome boast. But Sherman's hated Blue Bellies, 60,000 strong, cut a 60-mile swath of destruction through Georgia. They burned buildings, leaving only the blackened chimneys, Sherman's sentinels. They tore up railroad rails, heated them red hot, and twisted them into iron donuts and Sherman's hairpins. They bayoneted family portraits and ran off with valuable souvenirs. War is all hell, admitted Sherman later, and he proved it by his efforts to make Georgia howl. One of the major purposes of Sherman's march was to destroy supplies destined for the Confederate Army and to weaken the morale of the men at the front by waging the war on their homes. Sherman was a pioneer practitioner of total war. His success in Shermanizing the South was attested by increasing numbers of Confederate desertions. Although his methods were brutal, he probably shortened the struggle and hence saved lives. But there can be no doubt that the discipline of his army at times broke down as roving riffraff, Sherman's bummers, engaged in an orgy of pillaging. Sherman the Brute was universally damned in the South. After seizing Savannah as a Christmas present for Lincoln, Sherman's army veered north into South Carolina, where the destruction was even more vicious. Many Union soldiers believed that this state, the hellhole of secession, had wantonly provoked the war. The capital city, Columbia, burst into flames, in all probability the handiwork of the Yankee invader. Crunching northward, Sherman's conquering army had rolled deep into North Carolina by the time the war had ended. The politics of war. Presidential elections came by the calendar and not by the crisis. As fate would have it, the election of 1864 fell most inopportunely in the midst of the war. Political infighting in the North added greatly to Lincoln's cup of woe. Factions within his own party, distrusting his ability or doubting his commitment to abolition, sought to tie his hands or even remove him from office. Conspicuous among his critics was a group led by the overambitious Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase. Especially burdensome to Lincoln was the creation of the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War, formed in late 1861. It was dominated by the radical Republicans who resented the expansion of presidential power in wartime and who pressed Lincoln zealously over emancipation. Most dangerous of all to the Union cause were the Northern Democrats. Deprived of the talent that had departed with the Southern wing of the party, those Democrats remaining in the North were left with the taint of association with the seceders. Tragedy befell the Democrats and the Union when their gifted leader, Stephen A. Douglas, died of typhoid fever 7 weeks after the war began. Unshakably devoted to the Union, he probably could have kept much of his following on the path of loyalty. Lacking a leader, the Democrats divided. A large group of war Democrats patriotically supported the Lincoln administration, but tens of thousands of peace Democrats did not. At the extreme were the so-called Copperheads, named for the poisonous snake that strikes without a warning rattle. Copperheads openly obstructed the war through attacks against the draft, against Lincoln, and especially after 1863 against emancipation. They denounced the president as the Illinois ape and condemned the N-word war. They commanded considerable political strength in the southern parts of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Wow. Notorious among the Copperheads was a sometime congressman from Ohio, Clement L. Vallandigham? Vallandigham? This tempestuous character possessed brilliant oratorical gifts and unusual talents for stirring up trouble. A Southern partisan, he publicly demanded an end to the wicked and cruel war. The civil courts in Ohio were open, and he should have been tried in them for sedition, but he was convicted by a military tribunal in 1863 for treasonable utterances and was then sentenced to prison. Lincoln decided that if Vallandigham liked the Confederates so much, he ought to be banished to their lines. This was done. Vallandigham was not so easily silenced. Working his way to Canada, he ran for the governorship of Ohio on foreign soil and polled a substantial but insufficient vote. He returned to his own state before the war ended, and although he defied King Lincoln and spat upon a military decree, he was not further prosecuted. The strange case of Vallandigham inspired Edward Everett Hale to write his moving but fictional story of Philip Nolan, The Man Without a Country, which was immensely popular in the North and which helped stimulate the devotion to the Union. The fictional Nolan was a young army officer found guilty of participation in the Aaron Burr plot of 1806. He had cried out in court, "Damn the United States! I wish I may never hear of the United States again." For this outburst, he was condemned to a life of eternal exile on American warships. think the feeling from the spit that I inhaled is gone now. Okay, the election of 1864. As the election of 1864 approached, Lincoln's precarious authority depended on his retaining Republican support while spiking the threat from the Peace Democrats and Copperheads. Fearing defeat, the Republican Party executed a clever maneuver. Joining with the War Democrats, it proclaimed itself to be the Union Party. Thus, the Republican Party passed temporarily out of existence. Lincoln's renomination at first encountered surprisingly strong opposition. Hostile factions whipped up considerable agitation to shelve homely old Abe in favor of his handsome nemesis, Secretary of the Treasury Chase. Lincoln was accused of lacking force, of being over-ready to compromise, of having won the war, and of having shocked many sensitive souls by his ill-timed and earthy jokes. Prince of Jesters, one journal called him. But the ditch Lincoln move collapsed, and he was nominated by the Union Party without serious dissent. Lincoln's running mate was ex-tailor Andrew Johnson, a loyal War Democrat from Tennessee who had been a small slave owner when the conflict began. He was placed on the Union Party ticket to sew up the election by attracting War Democrats and the voters in the border states, and sadly, with no proper regard for the possibility that Lincoln might die in office. Southerners and Copperheads alike condemned both candidates as birds of a feather. Two ignorant, third-rate, boorish, backwoods politicians born in log cabins. Embattled Democrats, regular and Copperhead, nominated the deposed and overcautious war hero General McClellan. The Copperheads managed to force into the Democratic platform a plank denouncing the prosecution of the war was a failure. But McClellan, who could not otherwise have faced his old comrades in arms, repudiated this defeatist declaration. The campaign was noisy and nasty. The Democrats cried, "Old Abe removed McClellan. We'll now remove Old Abe." They also sang, "Mac will win the Union back." Union Party supporters shouted for Uncle Abe and Andy and urged, "Vote as you shot." Their most effective slogan, growing out of a remark by Lincoln, was, "Don't swap horses in the middle of the river." Lincoln's re-election was at first gravely in doubt. The war was going badly, and Lincoln himself gave way to despondency, fearing that political defeat was imminent. The anti-Lincoln Republicans, taking heart, started a new movement to dump Lincoln in favor of someone else. But the atmosphere of gloom was changed electrically as balloting day neared by secession and Northern victories. Admiral Farragut captured Mobile, Alabama, after defiantly shouting to the now famous order, "Damn the torpedoes, go ahead." General Sherman seized Atlanta. General Little Phil Sheridan laid waste to the verdant Shenandoah Valley of Virginia so thoroughly that, in his words, a crow could not fly over it without carrying his rations with him. The president pulled through, but nothing more than necessary was left to chance. At election time, many Northern soldiers were furloughed home to support Lincoln at the polls. One Pennsylvania veteran voted 49 times, once for himself and once for each absent member of his company. Other Northern soldiers were permitted to cast their ballots at the front. Lincoln, bolstered by the bayonet vote, vanquished McClellan by 212 electoral votes to 21, losing only Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey. But Little Mac ran a closer race than the electoral count indicates. He netted a healthy 45% of the popular vote, big number to Lincoln's bigger number, piling up much support in the southern infiltrated states of the Old Northwest in New York, and also in his native state of Pennsylvania. One of the most crushing losses suffered by the South was the defeat of the Northern Democrats in 1864. The removal of Lincoln was the last ghost of a hope for a Confederate victory, and the Southern soldiers would wistfully shout, "Hurrah for McClellan," when Lincoln triumphed. Desertions from the sinking Southern ship increased sharply. Grant outlasts Lee. Let me take another sip. Okay. After Gettysburg, Grant was brought in from the west over Meade, who was blamed for failing to pursue the defeated but always dangerous Lee. Lincoln needed a general who, employing the superior resources of the North, would have the intestinal stamina to drive ever forward, regardless of casualties. A soldier of bulldog tenacity, Grant was the man for this meat-grinder type of warfare. His overall basic strategy was to assail the enemy's armies simultaneously, so that they could not assist one another and hence could be destroyed piecemeal. His personal motto was, "When in doubt, fight." A grimly determined Grant, with more than 100,000 men, struck toward Richmond. He engaged Lee in a series of furious battles in the wilderness of Virginia during May and June of 1864, notably in the Leaden Hurricane of the Bloody Angle and the Hell's Half Acre. In this wilderness campaign, Grant suffered about 50,000 casualties, or nearly as many men as Lee commanded at the start, but Lee lost about as heavily in proportion. In a ghastly gamble on June 3, 1864, Grant ordered a frontal assault on the impregnable position of Cold Harbor. The Union soldiers advanced to almost certain death with papers pinned on their backs bearing their names and addresses. In a few minutes, about 7,000 men were killed or wounded. Public opinion in the North was appalled by this blood and guts type of fighting. Critics cried that Grant the Butcher had gone insane, but Grant's reputation was undeserved, while Lee's was overrated. Lee's rate of loss, one casualty for every 5 soldiers, was the highest of any general in the war. By contrast, Grant lost 1 of 10. Grant had intended to fight battles out in the open, a tactic he had perfected in the West. It was Lee, not Grant, who turned the Eastern campaign into a war of attrition fought in the trenches. With fewer men, Lee could no longer seize the offensive, as he had at Chancellorsville or Gettysburg. Lee's new defensive posture, in turn, forced Grant into some brutal arithmetic. Grant could trade 2 men for 1 and still beat the enemy to his knees. "I propose to fight it out on this line," he wrote, "if it takes all summer." It did, and it also took all autumn, all winter, and part of the spring. In February 1865, the Confederates, tasting the bitter dregs of defeat, tried desperately to negotiate for peace between the 2 countries. Lincoln himself met with Confederate representatives aboard a Union ship moored at Hampton Roads, Virginia, to discuss peace terms, but Lincoln could accept nothing short of union and emancipation, and the Southerners could accept nothing short of independence. So the tribulation wore on, amid smoke and agony, to its terrible climax. The end came with dramatic suddenness. Rapidly advancing Northern troops captured Richmond and cornered Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia in April 1865. Grant, stubble-bearded and informally dressed, met with Lee on the 9th, Palm Sunday, and granted generous terms of surrender. Among other concessions, the hungry Confederates were allowed to keep their horses for spring plowing. Tattered Southern veterans, Lee's ragamuffins, wept as they took the leave of their beloved commander. The elated Union soldiers cheered, but they were silenced by Grant's stern admonition. "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." Lincoln traveled to conquered Richmond and sat in Jefferson Davis's evacuated office just 40 hours after the Confederate president had left it. "Thank God I have lived to see this," he said. With a small escort of sailors, he walked the blasted streets of the city. Freed slaves began to recognize him, and crowds gathered to see and touch Father Abraham. One black man fell to his knees before the emancipator, who said to him, "Don't kneel to me. This is not right. You must kneel to God only, and thank him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." Sadly, as many freed slaves were to discover, the hereafter of their full liberty was a long time coming. The martyrdom of Lincoln. On the night of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, only 5 days after Lee's surrender, Ford's Theater in Washington witnessed its most sensational drama. A half-crazed, fanatically pro-Southern actor, John Wilkes Booth, slipped behind Lincoln as he sat in his box and shot him in the head. After lying unconscious all night, the great emancipator died the following morning. "Now he belongs to the ages," remarked the once critical Secretary Stanton, probably the finest words he ever spoke. Lincoln expired in the arms of victory, at the very pinnacle of his fame. From the standpoint of his reputation, his death could not have been better timed if he had hired the assassin. A large number of his countrymen had not suspected his greatness, and many others had even doubted his ability, but his dramatic death helped to erase the memory of his shortcomings and caused his nobler qualities to stand out in a clearer relief. The full impact of Lincoln's death was not at once apparent to the South. Hundreds of bedraggled ex-Confederate soldiers cheered, as did some Southern civilians and Northern Copperheads, when they learned of the assassination. This reaction was only natural because Lincoln had kept the war grinding on to the bitter end. If he had only been willing to stop the shooting, the South would have won. As time wore on, increasing numbers of Southerners perceived that Lincoln's death was a calamity for them. Belatedly, they recognized that his kindliness and moderation would have been the most effective shields between them and vindictive treatment by the victors. The assassination fortunately increased... The assassination unfortunately increased the bitterness in the North, partly because of the fantastic rumor that Jefferson Davis had plotted it. A few historians have argued that Andrew Johnson, now president by bullet, was crucified in Lincoln's stead. The implication is that if the rail splitter had lived, he would have suffered Johnson's fate of being impeached by the embittered members of his own party, who demanded harshness, not forbearance, toward the South. The crucifixion thesis does not stand up under scrutiny. Lincoln no doubt would have clashed with Congress. In fact, he had already found himself in some hot water. The legislative branch normally struggles to win back the power that had been wrestled from it by the executive in time of crisis. But the sure-footed and experienced Lincoln could hardly have blundered into the same quicksands that engulfed Johnson. Lincoln was a victorious president, and there's no arguing with victory. In addition to his powers of leadership refined in the war crucible, Lincoln possessed in full measure tact, sweet reasonableness, and an uncommon amount of common sense. Andrew Johnson, hot-tempered and impetuous, lacked all of these priceless qualities. Ford's Theater, with its tragic murder of Lincoln, set the stage for the wrenching ordeal of Reconstruction. The aftermath of the nightmare. The Civil War took a grisly toll in gore, about as much as all of America's subsequent wars combined. More than 600,000 men died in action or of disease, and and in all, over 1 million were killed or seriously wounded. The number of dead, amounting to 2% of the entire nation's population, greatly exceeded the number of Americans killed in World War II. The modern equivalent would be a loss of some 6 million American lives. To its lasting hurt, the nation lost its cream. Wait, did I read the right word? Yeah, to its lasting hurt, the nation lost the cream of its young manhood and potential leadership. In addition, tens of thousands of babies went unborn because potential fathers were at the front. Direct monetary costs of the conflict totaled about $15 billion, but this colossal figure does not include the continuing expenses, such as pensions and interest on the national debt. The intangible costs, dislocations, disunities, wasted energies, lowered ethics, blasted lives, bitter memories, and burning hates cannot be calculated. The greatest constitutional decision of the century, in a sense, was written in blood and handed down at Appomattox Courthouse, near which Lee surrendered. The extreme states' riders were crushed. The national government, tested in the fiery furnace of the war, emerged unbroken. Nullification and secession, those twin nightmares of the previous decades, were laid to rest. Beyond doubt, the Civil War, the nightmare of the Republic, was the supreme test of American democracy. It finally answered the question, in the words of Lincoln at Gettysburg, whether a nation dedicated to such principles can long endure. The preservation of democratic ideals, though not an officially announced war aim, was subconsciously one of the major objectives of the North. Victory for Union arms also provided inspiration to the champions of democracy and liberalism in the world. Liberalism the world over. The world over. Wait. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, sorry. Anyways, the Great English Reform Bill of 1867, under which Britain became a true political democracy, was passed 2 years after the Civil War ended. American democracy had proved itself, and its success was an additional argument used by the disfranchised British masses in securing similar blessings for themselves. The lost cause of the South was lost, but few Americans today would argue that the result was not for the best. The shameful cancer of slavery was sliced away by the sword, and African Americans were at last in a position to claim their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The nation was again united politically, though for many generations still divided spiritually by the passions of the war. Grave dangers were averted by the Union victory, including the indefinite prolongation of the peculiar institution, the unleashing of the slave power on weak Caribbean neighbors, and the transformation of the area from Panama to Hudson Bay and into an armed camp with several heavily armed and hostile states constantly snarling and snipping at one another. America still had a long way to go to make the promises of freedom a reality for all its citizens, black and white. But emancipation laid the necessary groundwork, and a united and democratic United States was free to fulfill its destiny as the dominant republic of the hemisphere, and eventually of the world. Okay, that's the chapter. Let me read that one sentence again. It said, victory for Union arms also provided inspiration to the champions of democracy and liberalism the world over. The world over? Oh, okay, now I understand. Okay. Yay! 21.